Welcome to the Your Audio Solutions podcast, episode 4. We have a great episode for you today. It's with Lij Shaw, who you might know for his podcast, Recording Studio Rockstars, which I will leave a link to in the description below. Lij also has his own studio, the Toy Box Studio in Nashville, which you will also find a link to in the description below. And it was a great conversation with Lij. I hope you're going to really enjoy this one. We talked about him playing with his brother in a blues band in Hong Kong, working in his family's old school movie theater. And we also spoke about him working in a studio where he completely stripped down their studio just to rewire it in 7 days before the producer came back. There's also some great tips for you guys, how you can get into a studio today and what Lij is looking for in interns himself. He also gives some tips where you can save when you're reaching out to studios, and more importantly, actually, what not to say. We also spoke about his experience working for a band called Living Things, and about their journey to record their first record, but only to have the label drop it, but then staying together, working together, and finally get a record deal and a record released. However, their relationship came to an end, and Lij tells us about that journey and not getting paid and how that changed his career going forward. Lij also tells us how he started his studio, the Toy Box Studio, and how he went about finding clients for his studio. And he also gives us some tips of what you need on your website to make it easy for clients to contact you. Also, Lij told me, maybe you know about this already if you followed him for a while, but he recently, or a few years ago, got into the crosshairs and got a cease and desist letter from the city of Nashville saying he had to shut down his recording studio. So that's something he is battling right now, and any support you can give, especially if you live in Nashville, help Lij out and give him your support, and make Nashville remove this ridiculous ban, because Nashville is a city of music. So yeah, support him if you can. And also we touched upon work-life balance and how working less can actually let you be more productive. And he gave us some cool tips and tricks on how to be more productive. And before we get into the conversation with Lij, I want to tell you about a guide, a free guide you can download at youraudiosolutions.com. It's called 3 Tested Ways to Increase Your Client Base. It's a great guide I put together for you, especially if you're a home studio owner or you're working in a professional recording studio, but you want to find more clients. I give some tips on how to find clients online, how to contact them using my email, and I'll give you my email in the guide too. And also a great technique called the coffee technique, which I have used myself many times, and it's a great way of building relationships or getting into a recording studio, for example. Rather than just saying, hey, I want a job, do you have a job for me? This is a better way of building that relationship and eventually getting into a studio, for example, or just getting to know people in your industry. It's a great technique. So check that one out in the guide too. It's called 3 Tested Ways to Increase Your Client Base. I think you'll love it. You find it on the site. But yeah, now over to Lij Shaw. I thought the perfect place to start this podcast would be, you having a blues band with your brother in Hong Kong. I just love to know how that happened.
Sure, man. I'll tell you. So years ago, I was in school for architecture in St. Louis, and I finished school, and I didn't know if I really wanted to be an architect, but I had a friend who invited me to go travel Europe with him for the next year in the fall, and so it was pretty exciting. We were backpacking around Europe, and we ended up in London, and I was working in London in one pub, and he was working in another. And I had been really interested in music and playing in bands all through college, and I brought my acoustic guitar with me and was like, playing every chance I could, there, just, noodling around, writing songs. And my brother happened to be in Hong Kong doing his, junior year of college abroad from his college, which was located in Minneapolis. And so he's in Hong Kong, and he chose it as the farthest away place he could think of to go do a year of travel in school. And we got a couple of chances to talk on the phone, which back then, this was in 1991, was pretty challenging to do. And you had to go buy a special card and, go to a payphone somewhere and dial numbers and try and talk to each other long distance. And you'd say something, and then about 10 seconds later, they'd say something back. And then 10 seconds later, you'd say something. So it was a really, really awkward conversation. But he basically let me know that while he was there that year, he was there studying piano. That was his interest in school, was to study music and piano. And he was also a drummer, and he had gotten a job in the local jazz club there, and then met a guy who was starting a band and a blues band, and got invited to join. So he was playing drums in a blues band while he was at school in Hong Kong, and they were playing regularly. And he was like, "Hey, dude, I got a crazy idea. You want to come to Hong Kong and play guitar in our band? We just lost our guitar player, and we need a new one. And we're playing like 5 nights a week in clubs around the city." And so I was like, 10 seconds later, I was like, "Oh, that sounds awesome."
Yeah.
And within a week, I decided to do it. And within a week, I was mentioning that I wasn't so sure I wanted to be an architect. This probably is an indicator of how much I really wanted to go into music. Within a week, I had bought a plane ticket to Hong Kong on my credit card, left 2 jobs, left an apartment that I was renting with other people, and left my girlfriend.
Wow, yeah.
And hopped on a plane and flew out to Hong Kong with no idea where I was going to stay or how I was going to make a living other than just being able to play some shows with my brother in this blues band. And I ended up staying there for 6 months. And we were like, we had a residency in a jazz club there, and then would play different, expat clubs around Hong Kong. So expat, of course, meaning where all the many of the non-Chinese, non-Hong Kong natives, Americans, Australians,
Right, yeah.
Brits, where we would all gather and go see music and have beers. So I was doing that, and then teaching English to kids on the side.
Nice. So what did you tell your girlfriend? How did you break it to her?
I'm sure I said something like, "I'm going to do this thing, and it's cool. I'll be back, or we'll keep in touch," or something. Which,
musician,
again, it was only written letters then, so that lasted for a little bit. It was only a girlfriend I'd been dating for about 2 weeks, so it was okay.
I believe there's almost 200 episodes.
Yeah, but she was great. She was great. So if she's listening, you're awesome, Angie.
Below. How old were you then? So you said it was 91. Description below.
Yeah, this was in 1991. I was 23 years old, and I had finished college and
working.
Loved playing music, and while I was in Hong Kong, this band was, it was called Blue Whale.
How he convinced the studio to let him completely strip down the studio.
But it was, the singer William Tong actually continued living in Hong Kong and went on to have some success with his music. Was a great harmonica player and singer and band leader and everything. It was just a lot of fun. I was a pretty terrible guitar player at that point, I'll be quite honest. It was my first chance to play guitar every day for 6 months straight and make that my main focus. And it's the thing that really moved me from, just kind of being okay at some things, but not really understanding a lot about music and guitars and chord progressions and stuff, and really learning much more and starting to learn how to solo over different chord progressions and just getting a better sense of what it meant to be in a band, and learning that really, really important lesson of getting up on stage and playing a show and having your sound just sound not good at all, and how do you get through that, Sometimes your amp just doesn't sound right.
Also, just because he had his studio. But so how was life in China then? Because you said you
Nashville,
played
the
mainly
city
for
of Nashville,
expats then. Was that
sent
why
him a
you
cease
could
and
do
desist
blues?
letter?
Or
I think so. I think so.
He
Although
had
we
to
did
shut
play for a
down
lot
his
of
home
local
recording
Chinese and
studio.
stuff too. I mean, we'd play.
And
One of our
his
first
battle with
gigs
that
was in
today.
a fancy
so if you
restaurant,
can support that
and
cause
we
in
would
any
be up
way, or
there on
that
a
fight in
stage,
any
and
way,
people would be eating dinner at tables,
I recommend you
and we
doing
would
so
play
if you
for
live
like
in Nashville,
45
that's
minutes and then get a
easier, I
10-minute
guess.
break and then go
We
play
also
for
talk
45
about
minutes.
work-life balance
And we
and
just had
how
a,
actually working
like a
less
set
can let you
list
be
of
more
classic
productive.
blues covers
And
and,
Lij has some cool tips on how you can speed
Eric
up your
Clapton,
workflow
You Look
and all those
Wonderful
sort of
Tonight
things.
and stuff like that.
Right. So it's a great
You know,
podcast. A lot of
we would get a lot
funny
of
moments and a lot of
requests at the
things you can
time
take away
to
and
play
apply to your own
Unchained
career.
Melody because
But before
the
we get
movie
into
Ghost
the
had just
conversation
come
with
out, and
Lij,
that was
I
a big
talk
hit
to you about
at
a
the time.
free guide you can download at
That's cool, man.
rewire.com. It's called
I mean, so
Three
were your
Tested
parents
Ways
into
to
music, or
Increase Your
how did
Client
you
Base.
initially get into music?
This is a guide I
Yeah,
put
I mean,
together
neither of
for
my
people
parents
with
were
home
working musicians or
recording
professional or
studios,
anything
or
like
you
that. They
work in
were
a
just
recording
hobby
studio,
musicians.
professional studio, but you want to
My
find
dad
more
would sing in
clients.
the church
So there's a
choir.
great
He
email
had the
you can
low bass
use to
voice,
reach out to bands online. You can use
all that kind of
Bandcamp,
thing.
whatever site you
And he would
prefer.
sit down at the piano
And I'm
every
sure
once
this
in a
email
while
will
and
help you out getting the
play
conversation
play
started.
songs. And I
If you
seem
want
to
to get into
remember he
recording
played.
studio or just
Years later, I
increase or
saw the
grow your
movie The
network,
Third Man,
there's the technique
and I was
called
like,
the
"Oh my
coffee
God, that's the
technique.
song that my dad would sit down
This
and
is a
play."
great way to
cool.
develop
Which is like a classic
relationships and meet
Hitchcock film.
people.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
actually
yeah.
used it to
Yeah,
get
and then
to
mom
my
was
first recording
was
studio.
a singer,
So
but she didn't really
great
like.
way, rather than just
Well,
writing
she
to
would play a little
studio
bit of
saying, "Hey, I
piano and
want a
she would
job.
sing and
Do you have
she'd
a job
sing
for me?"
lullabies
This
and
is a
stuff. But she was
better way, in
more
my experience,
interested in music,
getting
so
your
she
foot in the
always
door.
made sure that we were
So check the guide out. I'm
going
sure
to
there's
see
some
music
great,
and getting
things you can
exposed
take
to
away
it.
and use yourself. And,
She played classical
check
music
it
in the
out,
car all the time, driving
rewire.solutions.com.
around.
And now over
And
to
where did
Lij
you grow
Shaw.
up again? It was in LA, was it? No.
No, Massachusetts.
Oh yeah, that's
So
right.
I was growing up in the suburbs of Massachusetts, and one of the other things that I think helped me end up doing what I'm doing now, which is making records, is our family ran a movie theater. Basically one of these kind of beautiful art theaters with the red curtains and paintings on the walls and stuff like that. And we would show a lot of the foreign films that would come through. This was in Maynard, Massachusetts. And so my stepdad had an opportunity to, and then invited me to do it with him. We both took lessons and classes from another movie projectionist there to learn how to become projectionists. So one of my first jobs, other than flipping burgers, was as a projectionist when I was high school, and then some through college, in the summers and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. That must have been cool to learn. I don't know if it's useful today, but
No, well, it was definitely super cool because you're learning how to run these classic old school movie projectors that had carbon arc lights in them, where you'd have to turn on the 220 volts and you'd touch them together and then pull them apart, and it would spark a giant spark, which would be a flame just running the whole time. And you'd have to do things like the negative and the positive, the cathode and the anode would shrink at different rates and stuff like that. So they'd be burning off. And so you'd put it in this machine and you'd have to set the timer so that it was bringing them together closer while the things were burning down, and not so fast that they would bump into each other, and not so slow that they would get too far apart and the light would go out. And just like analog tape in recording studios, you'd have to look at how long these things were and decide if you had enough time left on them for the next reel of film.
wow, that's crazy. And how did you deal with the sound too at the cinema? Or how was that delivered? That must have been on tape then, or?
No, so it was actually my introduction to tape was only because we had a reel-to-reel tape machine, and every time the movies were over and we needed to play music in the lobby and through the speakers, I would just thread on Cat Stevens' Tea for the Tillerman on this 2-track reel-to-reel and press play, and then it would just play through the stereo. And of course, it sounded great coming off tape. But the music and the sound that accompanied the movie was built into the side of the film. So 35 millimeter movie film, which was on, I know it was originally on acetate. I can't remember if it was still on acetate when I did it or something different. but it used to be extremely flammable. But they would have, the images and sprockets along the edges, and then over to the side of the images, between the image and one of the sprockets, there was this it was optical film soundtrack. So it was pretty cool. It would, as the film ran over through a light sensor, it would shine a light through the optical film soundtrack. And then on the other side, there would be a sensor that would pick up the light coming through. And it just like tape, I guess just like tape in this concept, it would generate a new signal based on how much light was coming through, and that would determine the sound that you were going to hear through the speaker. So it was analog.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. That must have been cool to learn, to be honest, or just experience, I guess.
Yeah, and that's actually has a lot to do with frame rates and stuff like that. That's where that all comes from. So 24 frames a second was the speed of the film. That's why when you open your Pro Tools session, you might see a 24 frames per second option in there, which has gone on to, be filmed forever.
Yeah, exactly, man. So, I mean, just jumping a bit here, that happens sometimes, but
that's all right.
You are in China. It's been 6 months. Why did you decide to move back then?
Okay, so, well, I didn't think I was going to stay in China forever. And also my brother finished his year of school and then he went back before I did. So, I was sort of finishing up and heading home for the summer. But while we were in China, when we were in Hong Kong, again, this band was having some success. So we had a chance to go into a studio and record a song for a compilation album. This was the Gulf War. Was around that time too. So that was a topic, and the song that William wrote. And so we went in to go record this, and it was the first time I was ever in a pro studio and really got to look around and go see a tape machine and see a console and see all the lights and everything. And I just had this feeling like, this is really cool. I think I could actually get into this,
Yeah. So that was what sparked or that you wanted to pursue a career in audio after that?
Yeah. So I decided right then and there that when I went back to the States and went home, first thing I was going to do was see if I could find a school to teach me how to record in the studio and go learn about that, which is kind of funny to me now looking back on it, because I had no reason to believe that schools how to do this even existed. I didn't know anything about this. I didn't know that it was something that might be considered, an actual career path and all that. I just thought it looked cool, and I was like, I want to go do this.
Yeah.
So I came back and I went to Berklee School of Music to go check that out. Of course, that's right in Boston. That was right in my backyard. And I went and I interviewed with somebody and talked to them in the admissions office. And, it looked like it could be awesome, except it was like $10,000 a semester or a year. And I just didn't have the money. I didn't have that kind of funds for going to college a second time.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah, because you went to architect school before, right? That was the thing.
Yeah. Let's put it this way. Dad was already done helping me get through college. Yeah. I was lucky that he helped me through the first time,
Right.
But so luckily the guy in the admissions office said, well, there are other options for you. And there's a magazine that called something, and they just came out with their audio school issue, and so there's reviews of all these different schools, and I was like, oh, cool. And so as I'm leaving, I'm like, what was the name of the magazine again? It's called Mix Magazine. So that was my introduction to that, and I went to the newsstand and found a copy of Mix and picked it up. I mean, this was outside Berkeley, so you would find a copy of Mix in a newsstand. You might not anywhere else.
Right, yeah.
But anyway, so I got that, and then I read through it, and I was just fascinated by all these different school opportunities. And there were still a lot at that point, honestly. I ended up writing away to something like 50 schools.
That must be more than today, right?
No, I mean, I don't know. I think there's more today, but maybe I'm wrong. I mean, people talk about how these schools are appearing. And now that I say it out loud, 50 sounds like an awful lot back then.
Yeah. But yeah, anyhow, so you find this list, and did you write to one of those schools? You said.
Yeah, so I wrote to all of them, I think, or a bunch that looked interesting to me, and then ended up finding one that was in there called MTSU, Middle Tennessee State University, and that's down here just south of Nashville in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And they had just built like a brand new building and facility with multiple studios in it and a MIDI lab and all this wonderful stuff. It was like, they had an SSL console. I didn't know what an SSL was at that point, but it just looked and sounded like a really amazing place. And the cost of going there was so low compared to anything else. When so what I did is I moved to Nashville, lived here for a year, just living and working, and became an in-state resident. And then it was like $800 a semester to go to school there full time and get a second degree for a couple of years. So it was super cheap.
And that was because you became a resident in that state?
Yeah, because I've lived here long enough to be considered a resident of the state.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that was a thing.
I mean, it was then. I don't know if it still is, but I imagine it is.
Oh, that's cool. Okay, so you got into that school too?
Yeah, so I got into MTSU. I ended up getting a second bachelor's degree. This time it was a bachelor's of science in recording engineering. And I think it took me 2.5 years. And then at the end of that, I was also interning in a studio in Nashville, which was a little bit of a haul. You had to drive 30, 45 minutes, something like that, to get to the internship. But it was at a wonderful studio called Woodland. And it had been around for decades and decades and had, gold records and platinum records all up and down the hallways. And it was a great place. And so that internship was really my first introduction from school into a real studio. And it was the record, one of the first records that came through there. I was actually hired as a technical intern, so I wasn't in the studio making the records. I was answering phones and I was building cables and wiring panels and doing all this stuff. But everybody was very friendly, and so I was coming and going. And the owner, Bob Solomon, was also super generous and gave me a set of keys right away so I could let myself in, and even allowed me to come in on weekends to go use the studio if it was not being used. But one of the first records that came through was Emmylou Harris' Wrecking Ball, being produced by Daniel Lanois. So I got introduced to him and his whole crew and all the musicians that were playing on that. And that was just really fascinating and amazing to be around.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially just starting out. It must be awesome. So how long was that internship? Was it for a few years or?
No. It was like 6 months or something like that. It wasn't super long. They actually, as I finished the internship, they had lots more to do. So they just hired me on to continue wiring. And I started building Studio C, which was owned by Stephen Durr and Steve Hennig. And actually, I just had Stephen Durr on my podcast too. So it was cool to reconnect with him. But these guys had like Elvis's old API desk in there, and we're building a whole nother studio. And it was really amazing to see all that come together and get put together. But I got to build the patch bays and the mic panels and things like that.
Yeah, that must have been great. I mean, because did you learn that in school?
I did. I minored in electrical engineering, and which was my absolute introduction to electronics. I knew nothing about it before that, and I loved it. It was fascinating, totally amazing learning about how electronics work and beginning to understand, the inner guts of gear. But the school only barely touched the surface of how audio stuff works. It was a little more general understanding of electrical engineering.
Right. I mean, because just talking electronics and things, that's one thing. I mean, we did study it too in the school I went to, but that's one of the harder topics. But it also feels like one of the, if you understand electricity or electronics, you're well off, right?
Yeah, I think it's been hugely helpful. So that gave me the confidence to build things and to wire things and begin to learn soldering. And then at my internship that was my real, like, pedal to the metal, both feet on the ground, learning how to solder and, learning how to build cables that are reliable and work well, and learning how to make a patch bay and learning how to do, I don't know, if you've seen the back of a patch bay before, and if your listeners have ever seen what really looks like the back of a professional patch bay, it is like, it's an amazing loom, beautiful loom of wires and everything that's really hard to put together. Now I can't do it, unfortunately, because I need reading glasses, and it's just so hard for me to see those teeny tiny things.
Yeah. You need your own intern who can do it.
And I do.
Okay.
And I have. Every chance I get.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Okay, so you work in Woodland. That was the studio, right? Woodlands?
Yeah, Woodland Studios. Yeah.
Right. How long were you there then as a freelancer? Were you a freelancer or employed?
Oh, that wasn't very long either, actually. I probably could have continued longer, but the boss called me into the office one day and he's like, look, here's what I'm offering you. I need you to switch your schedule and come in at midnight, and we're going to provide you with the things that need to be repaired, and you fix them so that they're ready in the morning, like basically working a third shift from midnight to 8 a.m. every night. And I was just like, man, that's just not for me, dude.
No,
I don't want to do that shit, Oh, sorry, I didn't ask you if I could swear on the podcast.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, go ahead.
But it's like, I was more than happy to put in the hard work and learn how to wire and solder and do all that stuff. But it's not where I want to go with it. I wanted to make records. I wanted to be making music and making records. And I was still gigging with my band, so I would leave town for certain weekends to go tour and play a show in Chicago or something like that. And my boss at that time, he's like, "What are you doing? What do you want to be? You want to be an engineer? Or you want to be a musician?" And of course he was right, but in being right, I had to understand that and make that decision. Just be like, you know what? I think I want to be the musician, producer, engineer in the studio making records, and I don't want to give up the music side of it. So that ended after, I don't know, another 6 months or something like that. And then I got a couple of jobs delivering pizzas. I needed something to pay my rent.
Sure, yeah.
And so I was delivering pizzas for a minute. I was kind of enjoying hanging out, having beers with my roommate, delivering pizzas. I was getting sucked into that thing that we all do in our early 20s, if you let it. And then I was trying to, I was proud of myself for zipping around to go deliver the next pizza. I did a U-turn in an intersection and somebody slammed into me. And
wow.
I just totaled my car. Luckily, nobody was hurt. We were lucky about that.
Yeah.
But my car was done. And so there I was back at the apartment. I couldn't deliver the pizzas anymore. Didn't have a car. Didn't know what I was going to do. And I was like, all right, Lij, it's time to hit the pavement and go, take resumes to studios and go find yourself an actual job.
Yeah. But so how did you go about finding places to work or even apply to them?
Well, I'll tell you, it was kind of a fun story. When I was at Woodland Studios, there were a number of records that came through. I told you Emmylou Harris was one. There was another guy who would come through and do dance remixes off of ADAT machines with Ensoniq Paris, believe it or not. Usually that's the DAW. It's like a cool, funky old DAW. But anyway, so then there was also some guys that came in and they were doing a record for Jill Sobule, and it was being mixed by a guy named Roger Mutino, and the two producers were Robin Eaton and Brad Jones. And I just remember hearing they'd leave the door open while they were mixing to the lobby, so I'd be walking over there and I'd hear music coming. I was like, oh, this is cool sounding. This is different. I'm really intrigued by this. And I'd meet them by the coffee machine, and they're real friendly and stuff. And I was like, oh, I like these guys. So now fast forward 6 months later, and I'm thinking about where I need to get a job, and I took resumes too of some studios around town. I just looked in the Yellow Pages, which was our phone book, and I just sort of found studios that that I just found them in there, and I just went by and dropped off a resume, called them, did the smiling and dialing. But I also went to the record store one day, and there was a new record out, and it was Jill Sobiel's new record, and it had this hit song on it called "I Kissed a Girl," which was before it came out again a decade later. So different song, different artist, but it was a big hit for her. And I bought the record and took it home and listened to it, and I was really knocked out by it. And I just thought it was a super cool record, great, brilliant production ideas on it, great sound. And I just flipped the record over, and I remembered that my boss at Woodland, Bob, had said, "Oh yeah, those guys, I think they have another studio here in Nashville. They got an ADAT studio," is the way he described it. And I flipped the record over, and I saw the name of their studio, which was called Alex the Great Recording. And so I just pulled out the phone book again, found Alex the Great Recording, called the number, which, if you pause for a moment and think about it, I called the number and I asked for the name of the producer. So if you pause for a moment, you think about it, in the tradition of big studios and records coming and going and producers coming and going, like, what's the likelihood that the producer is going to be at the studio number that you call?
Yeah, exactly.
But I took a chance that maybe they would be, or maybe this was their studio or something. And Brad Jones ends up answering the phone, which also was lucky because he doesn't always answer the phone. A lot of times it goes to voicemail. But I just happened to catch him on the phone that day, and we talked for a minute. And I told him who I was and that I was looking for an opportunity, to be an assistant engineer. And he invited me to come over and meet him. So I did, and had a meeting with him, and he popped in a mix from my tape from school I brought with me, and he listened to it, and he gave me a couple of tips, but thought it sounded cool, and ended up bringing me on board and just saying, those guys ended up hiring me to assist on some records, and just gave me a chance to come over there and be around the studio. And next thing you know, I was working with Jill Sobiel on our next record, and had done records with bands. Let's see, who was it? June, I think, was the band that was in there, doing an indie rock record. And that was super fun. That was the first one where I got hired to actually be the assistant every single day for a couple of weeks. And it was massive, dude. I got offered, get ready for this, $50 a day.
Well, not bad.
To be an assistant on the record. And we're talking about show up in the morning, go till 10 p.m. midnight. And I was absolutely ecstatic. I was so thrilled.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, so how old were you then? Was that mid-90s then? Late 90s?
Yeah, that was mid-90s. I was about 25, going on 26.
Right. Well, that's
27. Yeah, I think I was 26 at the time. Yeah.
Right. That's a great gig. To be
honest.
It
was really, really good. And the other thing that happened too was, so I also met, I met Brad Jones there first, and then later I met Robin Eaton, and he came in, and we really connected too. And we've all both those guys I've maintained friendships with for to this day. But Brad was still hitting the road and touring some, and he was going and playing with Matthew Sweet, I think. So he would be off on tour with Matthew, and then I kept saying to Rob, these guys had the studio put together with a 32-channel Mackie board and ADATs and outboard gear. Really cool studio. Really, really great vibe. I mean, it still looks like the ideal indie rock studio that we all want to make records in. At least I do,
Yeah.
And so they had the studio set up like that, but the gear was still hooked up with a lot of cheap cables, or guitar cables were going through the patch bay, going to outboard gear. And I just looked at it, and I had just come from this pro studio where I had helped build, real TT patch bays and all this stuff. And I was like, man, you guys gotta, we gotta upgrade this and get it, up to the present, up to the 21st century here.
Mm-hmm.
Or I guess it was was the 20th century. No, it was
Yeah, it's a bit
right.
confusing.
It was the 20th century still. Wow. All right.
Yeah.
So we got to get up to catch up with the 20th century.
Yeah.
Because this was like 90, 95, 96. Or actually more like 97, I think so. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, Brad is somebody who's really, really fantastic as a producer and engineer. And one of the skills that he relies on is consistency, which means like, I've got my way of doing things. I'm sticking to this because this works. Like, I don't need to change a bunch of stuff and like upgrade. Why do I want to upgrade? This I'm getting great results this way. And I've since learned that that's actually a really smart way to do things because, it allows you to hone your own skill set and bring the best results to a project because you are bringing your best work and not getting distracted by all these shiny lights and things like that. Include the new stuff when the new stuff is a good choice, but don't just automatically include the new stuff. So Brad hit the road, went on tour. And luckily Robin was more easily convinced, and I convinced him to let me rewire the patch bay. So he was like, okay, cool. Yeah, when Brad heads out of town, you get in here and do your thing, and you got a week to do it. So Brad leaves. I go in there on the first day, and I just tear everything apart, man. I just completely tear it apart, and I start rewiring and building new cables and harnesses and patch bays. And I'm like rewiring the console to the patch bay and all the connectors going to the ADAT machines and to the analog tape machine, because they had a 2-inch 16-track MCI JH16 like I have here in the studio, and we would call it Fatty. So we'd use Fatty sometimes to track, and then we'd transfer stuff over to ADAT and go from there. But so I'm like rewiring all this stuff, and Robin comes in on like day 2 or something like that. And he just walks into the studio. And maybe it was even day 3 or something. And I've got about 7 days to do this.
Sure. Yeah.
And it just looks like the studio has just exploded, And he was like, oh my God. Oh my God. What's going on in here?
Yeah.
Really know what he was in for. And I was like, don't worry, dude, it's going to be great, And I completely was rearranging the whole logic of the patch bay and the way everything would get patched and stuff to make more sense.
Right.
And sure enough, I finished it out by the end of the week, and I had the whole place looking and sounding fantastic before Brad got back. And Brad walked in, and it was like a finished, ready to go thing. And really at first he was sort of frustrated with the new logic of the patch bay.
Yeah, sure.
But then he said, like, he came back to me later. He's like, after I worked on this for a while, I began to understand your logic, and now it makes much more sense to me.
Yeah. Oh, that was really well done, man.
Yeah, thanks. I don't recommend that everybody go destroy the studio that they get,
No.
given access to the first time they arrive. But,
Yeah.
If you can make a place better, I think it's part of what we do is just take the facility that you're working in, take the record you're working on, take the artist you're working with, and take it all so seriously that your goal is for them to have like a top experience, and just deliver your best work.
Yeah, exactly, man. Totally. There's on a backtrack there for a second, because we talked about, you finding a studio to work in and things. Because nowadays it's obviously different. We don't really use Yellow Pages, I guess.
Yeah.
So
no, sometimes I do. I'll use it to stack things on.
Yeah, that's a good idea, actually.
Make something.
Yeah. No, so I'm just wondering, do you have any tips for people who really want to get into a studio, how they can go about it today?
Yeah, I think interning is a great way. For me, when I have interns here, it gives us an opportunity for them to understand the studio. It gives an opportunity for me to teach them stuff, because really they don't know anything yet. Some know more than others. Everybody knows something different. But just like when I went into the studio for the first time, I didn't know anything about really actually making a record. I didn't know how it really gets done. I didn't know the kind of things that allow the musicians to work as well as they can. I just knew what it was like to be a member of the band, kind of making our own record, which is a very different experience when, like, your biggest concerns are sticking a 57 in front of something, pressing record, and then, where's the pizza, where's the bong, where's the beer.
Yeah.
But anyway, so interns coming and working with me, I think that's a great way to learn the studio and get to know it. And then when you just demonstrate that you have great capabilities and you really show that you're really committed and that you got great skills, and that the engineers at the studio or the studio owners or whoever it is begin to see that they could actually rely on you to help them do a certain task, that's a great way to start getting hired for stuff in a studio. I would say that's probably the place to start. There are, you may find a paid job right out of school or whatever going into a studio if there's some task that, demands your skill level already. But for me, I really wanted to work in the control room. I wanted to be making records with the artists, with the bands. And that was, I guess I wanted to be at a high level right away. And there's no way I was going to be given that responsibility right off the bat. I had to be around and really learn it for a while before I had a chance to do it. But I did. I also didn't wait around like somebody was supposed to give me an opportunity. I never did. I always looked for every excuse I could to be recording on my own. I had already, by the time I was in this studio, I'd already made a few records with my band. I had been in a studio and recorded many times, whether it was a 4-track or a studio at my old school or the school I had just gone to, or, gotten a chance to be in somebody else's studio and hung out with them and done stuff. So I think, you got to give yourself a lot of experience. It takes a while to really learn this stuff.
Yeah, exactly, man. And do you have like a preferred way of people reaching out to you, or maybe rather what they shouldn't say if they're looking for a place to work in?
I always appreciate it when somebody, when I receive an email from somebody and they're interested in an internship, or, I get some emails where they're interested in opportunities to work. Usually I'm just really friendly and I say like, hey, let's, come, we'll meet for lunch. I'll show you the studio. But, I don't really I wish I had a job opportunity for people all the time or for everybody, but I rarely do. It's usually more like, come up through the internship kind of thing. And then, I know a lot of studios are like that too. Like a place like Blackbird, for example, they teach their students and then they become interns, and then, a tiny select few might move on to become the actual engineers there. But so when I receive, and this is the part that is hopefully helpful, when I receive that email, I get a couple of different kinds of emails. I get one where somebody wants to be an intern and they send me a cover letter and a PDF of a resume, and they say like, I really want to work at your studio. It'll be a wonderful opportunity. Thanks so much, or whatever. And then you're reading this and you're like, do they even know what my studio is? Like, have they even looked at the website? Have they even like done any research? And a lot of times I find the answer is no. And that always just seems weird to me. I mean, it's one thing. I know if you're like trying to hit a lot of places and see what nibbles you get. You can't know a ton about every place, but as soon as you get a chance to come back to somebody, or if you're going to send a cover letter, at least like put the name of their studio in the cover letter. Don't just send an email that is a template. I mean, what's funny to me is like, come on, future interns, like, do you really have that many emails to write? I mean, like maybe 10. Maybe 20 at the most. I mean, it's not like you have to send out 100 emails or 200, and so therefore you can't possibly put the name of the studio in the actual email.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's one thing. I would say, like, making sure that your email is as personal as it can be, and mentions the studio itself or the producer that you're sending it to and references some work that they've done that you really appreciate, because that gets people's attention. Then all of a sudden they know that you actually are interested in them. You're not just looking for, a handout of some sort.
Exactly, man. Yeah, that's really good advice, and I think that can be really helpful to a lot of people. So let's go back to the journey. Where were we? You working for was it Brian and Robin? You said
Brad and Robin.
Brad, not Brian. Brad. Sorry. So yeah, you fixed his studio, and he liked it. You said. What happened next? Did you work for him for a long time, or?
I spent years over there with those guys, and I was still freelance, so I'd still go work in a handful of other places, and but really those were my most exciting recording opportunities, and I got to make my first record as a first engineer over there was for a band called Fluid Ounces, Big Notebook for Easy Piano. And it was a band that were also friends of mine from Murfreesboro when I had been at school, because this was a time in the 90s where there was like just like a huge wave of interest from record labels in indie music and indie bands. And there was a record label called Sponge Bath Records, which was started in Murfreesboro, which was, there were a handful of bands from the college that I was at that went onto that record label, and then they had bands from other states as well. But those guys were able to, send a couple of the bands into a studio like mine to start making records and see how things went, make a record or make a demo toward a record or whatever. And so I got a chance to make a record with Fluid Ounces. And that was the first time I was in the studio. I was engineering. There was another producer brought in, a guy named Ross Rice from Memphis. And it was just awesome. It was super fun. Seth Timms, who was the artist in that band, he really wanted to make his record strictly on analog. So he didn't want to have anything to do with ADAT. So that was also really fun, because here I was on a 2-inch 16-track tape machine, and we're staying entirely on analog. I think we were recording at 30 EPs, if I remember correctly, but I'm just going to guess that we were, because that probably gave us easier punch in. But we might have been at 15, which makes it a little trickier. But you get more tape time.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, so I got to make a record with those guys, and it was like tricky working on analog, because you had to be very, very careful about punching in and punching out. And there were some complicated bass parts that we had to really like punch in a few notes and punch out again and like really piece the thing together. And it was just, it was exciting, and it was stressful in a good way, not in a bad way. It was just like, everybody's trying to get this one little thing perfect. And if you totally screw it up when you punch because you're not paying attention, it's going to kind of blow it for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You got to be certain, I guess, or confident, I should say.
You just have to be paying attention, sharp, awake, paying attention. And so that brings me to a little story about one of the times, I think it was on that record, actually, there was one of the times that I was, trying to continue to join the band and all the festivities. And we're recording into the night, late into the night. And the band, of course, is, showing up with a couple of cases of beer every night, and beer's flowing and the pipes handing around, and I joined in on that and hit the pipe with the band. And then I went back over to the patch bay, and I took one look at it, and it was a giant mess of wires, and it was just a jungle, and it scared the crap out of me. And I was like, oh no, man, I can't do this.
Yeah.
So that was the point right then and there. I remember having this feeling like, okay, I can't mix smoking pot and working in the studio at the same time,
Right.
do those things together. So that was good for me, because then that was the point at which I made a mental choice to have a separation between work and play. And I was like, from here on out, I'm like the focused engineer who's trying to get everything just right. And I'm not having the party. You know, you can have a party after the session if you want to.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the party aspect, I don't know if I'm wrong here, but it seems like that has gone down a lot when it comes to recording, right?
Maybe it has. Maybe that has to do with the fact that a lot of people are paying for their own records these days, and
Yeah.
you know, everybody's on a tight budget and they're trying to get the most out of their time. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one. I mean, I don't think the party's gone away, depending on who you're talking to.
No.
But as an engineer, you know, I mean, as somebody who's maybe put in a lot of time and money into school, and you know, getting to that point, you know, you don't want to be too relaxed with it. You want to be a real professional if you can.
Yeah, exactly, man. I don't know what the name of this band was, but I don't know which time period either, actually. But I know I heard you speaking about you working with a band, and on and off for 10 years.
Yeah, right.
What was which band was that again?
Well, so there was an artist named Lillian Berlin, who was actually, I got to rewind all the way to the beginning again.
That's fine.
So when I met Brad Jones at Alex the Great, you know, he was like, "Hey, this is great." After our meeting, he said, "I'll tell you what, why don't you do this? So you can come in and learn the room and everything. Why don't you bring a band in here and record? How about we'll give you a weekend for $250 or something like that." And I was like, awesome, sounds killer, you know? So I left there and I talked to a buddy in St. Louis, and he was like, "Oh, you got to meet this other guy." And that was Lillian. And you know, I talked to him, and he brought his band, which I think was called Yellow Afternoon at the time. They brought their band down. They hopped in a van, drove down from St. Louis, and we spent a weekend in the studio. And like, you know, they needed a drummer. So I talked to the drummer that I met on the club lacrosse team I was playing in here. And he was like, "Man, I need more tape time." I was like, "Hey, you want to come play drums on this session just for free, for fun?" And he's like, "Sure." So, you know, we're in there Friday night, sound checking drums and recording with him. And then we ended up recording all through the weekend, until Sunday late. And they finally, you know, hit the road to go home. Meanwhile, we're like barely even sleeping. I think we all just slept on the foam gobos. We just turn them sideways, lay them on the floor, and sleep on those in the studio Saturday night, and get back up and go back to work.
Yeah.
So it was super fun, and that was, you know, my first chance to work with Lillian. And then we did more sessions like that. I started going up to St. Louis and doing sessions with him and his band there. And we'd go into different studios that he'd, you know, get access to. And, you know, he'd have a few bucks and, you know, get another ADAT studio up there for the weekend. And then he'd invite me to come up, and I'd get, you know, he'd offer me $50, which would pay for my gas to drive there and back. So I was basically just working for free.
Yeah.
But it was fun. I mean, we just all loved it, and we were just having fun doing it. It's what we wanted to do. And again, we'd go work through the night, not sleep, and really get into it. And then he ended up moving up to Chicago, and then started another band up there called the Trixo. And then same thing. I started going to Chicago to go. Well, I think they came down to Nashville some, and we'd go back to Alex the Great, and I'd go up there, and we'd go to different studios. And Cha-Cha Gonzalez, who was the singer in Atrixo, she had relationships and friendships up with the people who owned Smart Studio, which was Butch Vig's studio in Madison, Wisconsin. So that was like our crazy plan at that point was, they wanted to make demos and start recording as a band and try and get a record deal. They wanted to work with me. I wanted to work with them, but they didn't have any money. And I was like, well, let's work something out, because I really want to be producing. And so how about we make an arrangement where, like, I'll come record with you guys and produce this stuff for nothing. But we'll make an arrangement that I'll get paid on the back end when we get a record deal. So it was my first spec deal. And luckily, it totally worked out. It played out just fine.
Awesome.
But it was a ton of work, and you know, it was definitely a risky thing to do, because when you do spec deals, which basically just means, you know, working for free now with the hopes that if something goes right, you'll get paid later. You take the chance that something won't go right, and unfortunately, in the music business, most things don't get a big break. But so they would, the arrangement was also that they'd buy me a plane ticket. So they'd buy me a plane ticket. I'd fly from Nashville up to Chicago. They'd pick me up at the airport, hop in the car. We'd immediately drive up to Madison, and then we'd go check in at Smart Studios. And we had, I don't know how maybe they had to book it or something, or maybe we had some, you know, free studio access, but we'd spend the weekend in there recording as much as we could. And then, you know, we'd also work out of their home studio in Chicago some. And we just made demos for, I think it was for about a year or something like that. We did this. And then at the end of the year, they started meeting and greeting with record label people, and ended up getting signed to Hollywood Records.
Oh, great.
So those demos got us a record deal. And then, you know, we started the process of, you know, it took a minute once they got the deal, but then they got a budget to start recording, and we actually built a studio for them in their home studio in Chicago, and we started demoing songs for the record, new songs. Maybe some of them are the same, but anyway, we just continued working. And then the record label is like, all right, cool. You guys can go actually book out Smart Studios in Madison. And we went, camped out in there for like 2.5 months or something like that. Yeah. So they sent us in to go record there. And that was a crazy time, because it was like my first experience of 7 days a week in the studio, you know, living like a vampire. The day kept shifting later until we were showing up at like 4 p.m. and leaving the studio at 8 a.m., you know?
Right. Yeah.
It's very weird. And, you know, through that process, I lost yet another girlfriend who was like, I'm not waiting around in Nashville for you to come home from this.
Well,
You're never coming. And she was right. I was wrong. She was right.
Right.
But, you know, we were in the studio, and we were supposed to finish a record in a couple of months there, and we didn't even come close. So we basically, after being there for about 2 to 3 months, had to pack up and take everything from Smart Studios back to their home studio in Chicago in a rented apartment on a 3rd floor with neighbors all over the place, and just continue making the record. And we kept doing it. And when we built their home studio, we put in a Mackie mix. Basically, I modeled it after what I saw at Alex the Great. So we put in a Mackie console, we put in ADATs, and that was going to be the tools we used to make the record with. And we also put in a Pro Tools system, which was like Pro Tools 4 or 5 or something like that. It was early. And it was, at that time, the thinking was like, all right, you sync Pro Tools to the ADATs, and then if you need to do something in Pro Tools, you just fly it over to Pro Tools, edit it, and send it back to the ADATs, and that's how you're working. That's what we went into the demos thinking, and by the time we were up in Smart Studios, we realized, what are we doing? You just keep the entire record in Pro Tools. You don't need to use the ADATs at all. So when we were at Smart, that was our first time like working 100% in Pro Tools. And it was like my real crash course in how to use it. And that's what we were working on back in their home studio.
Oh, okay.
I'll pause for a second, let you ask another question.
That's fine, man. I don't mind you talking. That's the whole point. Yeah, because if that's the experience I heard about, did he get too much in the end? Was that the thing?
Yeah, well, you mean, yeah. You're probably referring to that experience, sort of like going from doing that to kind of ending it and moving on to new stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm still at the beginning of this experience in my story.
Okay, yeah.
But it's all right. We finished that record. It took us a full year to make the record instead of 2 months. And, I stopped getting paid, or I was waiting until we delivered the record before I'd get my final check. And I was like sleeping in a guest room on the porch at the studio. And we would, again, work 7 days a week in their Pro Tools and stuff. And they actually, we made so much noise, we got evicted in the process too. And so they were kicked out of their apartment. But we finished it, and that took us down to go mix it with Tom Lord-Alge in Miami. And so that was my introduction to Tom, was getting to see how he did things, and just, hugely eye-opening. I had no idea. And it was really amazing experience. I learned a ton. And then they were working on the artwork, and then the record label dropped the band.
Wow.
That was the end of it. All that work just got put on a shelf and never got released to be heard.
Yeah, that must have been awful.
It was awful. It was awful. I mean, it was like, my takeaway from it was that, you can't take back the experience that I had learning how to make records at that point anyway. But it was a lot of working for nothing for a project that wasn't ever actually going to get listened to.
Yeah, exactly, man. So was that when you decided to, let's take a break, I'm going back to Nashville?
One would think, oh yeah, I did go back to Nashville at that point. I went back and settled into my house. And then I think I think it was right about that time I also bought a house. So I finally had a chance to buy a house. I decided it was time to do it. I was about 30 years old at this point. And so I did that. But anyway, the band didn't break up. They decided that they wanted to start making new demos, and they talked to me and hired me to come up to Chicago and do it in their new apartment home studio. And so we did that. We started making demos. We did a couple, and then they all decided to move out to LA. So they moved out and got a house, and same thing, home studio and a rental house in Hollywood, which was a super cool, funky place that just like, that was my introduction to what Los Angeles is like, and like the kind of magical, wizardy, hippie vibe that coexists there with all this stuff.
Did you get to meet a lot of people there?
Well, kind of, yeah, kind of no. I mean, I have over time, but when I was going out there with those guys, I'd literally, again, they'd pick me up at the airport. We'd go check into their home studio, and we'd just be in there for all day, every day, until it was time to put me back on a plane, recording.
Yeah.
But so they were doing that, and then they were making more demos, and then I think it was a little later when Lillian was also started recording some of his own songs with his two brothers, Bosch and Eve, and he took one of those in and was like playing the Atrixo demo for a record label, and then played them his new demo, and they were like, well, we like this. We're interested in this. So next thing you know, I'm going back out there, and now I'm recording him as the singer in the band instead of Cha-Cha, who was singing before. And it was like a whole new vibe, and it was much more of a rock thing. And so we did that, and then again, those demos we completed and got a record deal. So I was pretty excited. So we got another record deal, and let's see, that at the time was with DreamWorks. I think that was the first label that they were signed to. And then we went into the studio and started making another record. And this time we did a few things. Actually, it started. They came back to St. Louis, and we set up a new home studio in their parents' basement.
Okay.
And then that was easier because I could drive up to that one. And I went up and worked with them, and again, just lived there. And we worked in their home studio, and started the demo process and getting songs ready. And it kind of goes back and forth over some years, so I might mix up the timeline. But as we did that record and that band was called Living Things, and that record did get released, a few versions of it. But Ahead of the Lions is the name of the record. and it was a fun rock record that turned
You
out.
you produced it and engineered it, or was it
Yeah, I
both?
co-produced it with the band, just like I was doing on everything. And I would engineer, and I would do all the Pro Tools work and all that stuff,
Right.
and
Yeah.
played some overdubs on it too. Played some guitar, some percussion, or whatever was needed.
Nice.
But it was fun. We got to go check into electrical studio in or studios in Chicago, which is Steve Albini's place, for a few months this time, and they have dorms there, so we were able to like stay there in the studio and live there and work. And we would track drums with Steve Albini, and then we'd sort of run our own overdubs
Yeah.
as needed. And then finally we brought the stuff back from there back to their home studio and set up and finished it out there, and then went out again to LA when that was done to go work with Ben Gross at the mix room, and camped out there for more months again at the very tail end of that record. And then the record was released on, I guess, on DreamWorks, and then later on Zomba
Nice.
Records.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice, man. And do you still work with those guys to this day, or?
No, so we finished that record and then went on to go do a second record, and that was when we spent a year on the record. Again, didn't finish anything. There was a lot of trouble with that, just because like I wasn't in charge. It wasn't my call to say it's done. It was the band's call, but they just kept wanting to explore stuff and try and get it right. And I think that one of the challenges we had was losing perspective. We'd work really hard on something and not really get a break from it. I certainly wouldn't get a break from it. And so it was hard to like maintain a good perspective on whether this stuff's, is this great? Should we scrap this and move to another thing? That kind of stuff. But we spent a year working on that record. And then finally at this point in my life, I had a new baby. I was married. I was, had moved my family into my house here in Nashville, and I just was like, I got to go home, guys. I can't keep doing this. And so that was the end of our relationship, working together. And, it ended badly at the time, but they were able to continue going on and mix with a guy named Michael Ilbert at Hansa Studios in Berlin, and some other guys along the way as well, and finished that record out, and it sounded great.
Okay, that's nice. It's great that they ended in a good way, I guess. I mean, for the record.
Yeah, for the record, for those
yeah.
guys, it did end good. But for me, and I've really thought about this a lot since then, and I've realized that sometimes when you're in a band and you're really, really deeply invested together, and it's not working anymore, or when you're in a relationship and that happens, at the end, there's kind of no way for it to end other than to just sort of like violently tear apart sometimes. And I think that's what had to happen for us a little bit. I mean, we weren't all angry at each other. It just was frustrating. And, I ended up not getting paid for a whole ton of work at the end from the record label, because it was a very triangulated kind of thing where it was like, I agreed to do stuff, band needed me to do it, I agreed to do it, but record label was like, well, this is what we wanted, so we're not gonna pay these invoices, kind of thing.
So how did that change your career going forward? What did you change after this experience?
So that particular transition was really life-changing for me. It's one of those perfect examples of when an absolute failure point that just seems like a disaster, where you're like, man, I feel like such a loser, at this point, turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to me.
Right.
Because it allowed me to 100% focus on my home studio, which I had just finished putting in my garage. And so I had this new place for myself to work, and having a home studio and working out of a home studio was something that I always really wanted to do. It had been basically my 5-year plan, for what that's worth, to one day have a home studio in a house where I can, live and do what I want and wake up and grab my coffee and just go down and start making a record. And so I had that here now, and I started working out of this place, and it really changed. I mean, the industry had changed some, but it also changed the way I was working. So I was no longer really trying to go for it to get a deal with the label or work with a major label or anything like that. I was focused more on working with independent artists, local artists, and that sort of thing. And I really enjoyed that. It was a lot of fun. I found myself working on a lot more projects because, they'd be shorter. It wouldn't take a year to make a record.
Yeah.
So it gave me a chance to iterate more and really like record something, try it again. I had also collected the gear that I needed to have a studio and make it work. And so I no longer was always trying some new piece of gear and stuff. I was like, all right, these are the tools I got. What can you do with them? And so I started to really explore mic placement. I started to understand how I could take the tools that I've already got and make them sound amazing, work more about getting the sound. I started to understand things like phase for the first time, really, believe it or not. I mean, I did understand that, but I think I got to understand it a whole lot better. And I realized that having limitations on on our tools and on the things that we can do when we're trying to create is a real positive. It's a plus. It helps us, get better at our ability to create because we now have limitations that we have to create within,
Yeah, of course.
Whereas when I was working with those guys, it was sort of like everything was a little too unlimited,
Right. Yeah.
A good example of that was the time we went into Blackbird Studios to go mix a song that was going to be one of their singles. And we checked into Studio A for 4 days, and we mixed all day and all night, every single day for 4 days. And at the end of that, it was like 8 a.m. on a Sunday, and we had been there all night, and we're just trying to print something to tape one last time and get out the door. And they kicked us out because they had another session coming. And we still didn't we had a mix, but it sucked. It wasn't any good,
Oh, yeah.
What we did is when we were in there, we're like, Blackbird Audio or Blackbird Studios here in Nashville has a sort of an almost unlimited supply of gear that you can use. And so we're like, well, great, we got to try them all on everything.
Yeah.
So we're starting to build the mix on the console. We're like, all right, kick drum, right? Let's hear this. Let's hear that. Let's hear this. Let's hear that. Let's hear this. And it was just totally ridiculous. And so it took us ages just to like get the mix started.
Yeah.
We did take time in there to do a guitar solo and we did tape flange while we were there. We set up 2 tape machines to flange a guitar solo. So it was fun. Again, it was a learning experience. We gave ourselves, by spending so much time in the studio, we gave ourselves a lot of opportunity to try things, get them wrong, learn how to get them right, just try everything and learn about how things sound and how they work.
Yeah, exactly, man. But so when you did start your own studio, so that's the Toy Box Studios, right?
Yeah, the Toy Box.
Yeah, how did you go about finding...
Studio mono. Not mono. I always say that singular.
Oh, say it again.
I said the Toy Box Studio singular, right. But I always accidentally say mono.
Right. But so when you started that, how did you go about finding new clients? What was your tactic?
Well, for me, I lived in a city that's steeped in music, and I had already been living and making records here for 15 years. So I knew people, and I didn't have to go too far to meet new people. But, I think the first official record I did in here, let me think about it. It'll come to me in just a sec. I did a jazz record in here. I did a folk record. These are just people that I either knew or, maybe met at an event or a party around town. And then word kind of spreads, a little bit, when you do something and people hear that you have a new studio, they come check it out. If you're meeting people that are maybe meet somebody who's interested in producing and they're starting out, and then they come see your studio and they're like, oh, cool, man. Yeah. What do we need to come, use your place? And, that's kind of some of the ways that it all just began.
Yeah. So where would you meet these people? Would you go to gigs or take them out for drinks, coffee?
I went to gigs some, but I'd also meet people at parties. I feel like I met people at a couple of different parties. In fact, I can remember 2 instances where that happened.
Right.
And it was just talking to people and telling them that I had a studio over in East Nashville, and they'd be like, oh, cool, come check it out. And then one thing leads to another. Or you have a session with somebody and it goes well and they tell a friend. So word of mouth is really important. I did have a website. This is all the way back to like 2005. I did make a website, or maybe 2007. Sorry, I did have a website, but it was, it wasn't like websites are today. It helped somebody look at it and see something, but it's not like today where I would recommend, that local stuff from word of mouth and meeting and greeting is a great strategy. But I would highly recommend that you have a website and that you have like a welcome form on there, all of which I'm going to need to add to my own site when the time comes. but a welcome form so people can actually contact you and get through to you. And I would do things like have an email on there or a phone number, and that's how people would reach out to me. And that was really helpful. Later on when I did have a website and sort of closer to the present before I started the home studio battle. Which maybe we'll talk about here in just a sec.
Yeah, sure.
But, when I was operating that way and my website was active, I would, people would just find the email on there or find the phone number and just click on it.
Right. So what was the studio battle thing? I must have missed that in my...
Oh, you didn't hear about that?
No.
Well, that's probably our biggest topic, but I don't know if I have enough energy to do it justice, but I'll give you an introduction to it.
Yeah, sure, man.
In 2015, after operating my studio for a decade as a home studio here in East Nashville, I got a cease and desist letter from the city of Nashville telling me I had to shut down my operations as a commercial recording studio in a residence.
Wow.
Yeah, so Nashville has a unique restriction, Davidson County, where if you are a resident in a home and in a residential zoning, you're not allowed to have a home business and have any customer or a client come over to your house.
Wow.
So that unfortunately makes all home studios that are working and making records with people here in Nashville illegal. So that's a bit of a problem because that's obviously been happening here for decades. But I just got caught in the crosshairs from what looks to be a random complaint from somebody who actually just wanted to start a home business themselves. And when they were told that they couldn't, they went on the internet, found me and said, well, what about this guy? Threw me on. So that really sucked. But since 2015, I haven't been, actively promoting my studio and advertising to clients to come in here and do that kind of stuff because they told me not to. But what I did do is I went on record in the local paper doing an interview and an article, and that made the front page of the Tennessean, and then then that caught the attention of 2 law firms, the Institute for Justice and the Beacon Center, which is here in Nashville. And those are both pro bono public advocacy law firms that specialize in property rights and economic liberties, which sounds really fancy. But what it means is they go out of their way to find people like me and help defend my right to be able to just make an honest living from my home.
Right, yeah.
So in 2017, we filed a high-profile lawsuit against the city of Nashville, and I'm going through that now still. Oh, actually, yeah, let's see. Let me back that up. In 2017, we actually applied for a rezoning to see if I could actually just get zoned to be allowed to do this. And then when the city, when that got a lot of attention, and the city still said no, even though 39 of my neighbors on all sides said, yeah, it's totally fine with us. Then we took the next step, which was to file the lawsuit. And so that's the stage I'm in now. And that will be coming up a little later. I'll probably be back in the courtroom to find out how that, what the results are.
That's crazy, man. So, I mean, did that affect your business negatively, or?
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah, I can imagine. And how were you able to keep going after that?
Well, one of the things that coincided with getting the cease and desist was actually starting my podcast and online business, Recording Studio Rockstars. And so I've been doing that all along, and I've started really pouring a lot of energy and focus into that, which has been great. And then I've still managed to be able to do some mixing here or there for, a client over the internet, somebody that I'm working with that way. But unfortunately, the city doesn't allow, in studio stuff. So Recording Studio Rockstars. I also, once a year in June, I take a studio down to the Bonnaroo Festival just below Nashville, and I do something called the Hay Bale Studios, where for 4 days we'll record up to 40 bands that come through, a few songs each. So it's like hundreds of songs every single. I guess it's about 100 songs every single year, and we've recorded and mixed and mastered over 1,000 in the 15 years that I've been doing it. And all these get played over radio, so radio stations will have access to them. So that's a really fun thing. And then I've also done some teaching. I've do online teaching, and I teach kids in the local schools. And there's a nonprofit here that'll hire me to come and record them reciting spoken word poetry and coach them through that on occasion. So just a variety of things, just basically do what I've always done in music, which is put all the pieces together and make it work.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's awful. And I really hope it gets sorted, because it's Nashville, I mean, yeah, every person has a studio probably, of some
sort. There are, maybe a couple of thousand studios in Nashville. Probably, it's hard to know an exact number, but considering that everybody with a computer and an interface and a microphone is a studio, and they are making records together in homes all over the place. Those are home studios, and many of them are clients, So anyway, my point is not to be anything remotely close to the guy who said, hey, why can't I do it, and throw other people under the bus. Now, my point is Nashville needs to make a change and recognize, not allow it to be, but simply recognize what already exists and just accept, like, this is what is and has been in Nashville for decades and decades. I think the first studios in Nashville were home studios. I don't have all the names of them, but I know that I think a lot of the first ones that started out in homes. And I think I know of at least one whose name I won't mention, but I think I know one that started out maybe in the late 50s, multi-track studio, and still exists, and it's still a home studio.
Wow. Okay.
So it's quite famous too.
Okay. I mean, yeah, that is strange, man. I really hope it's going to get sorted, and I'll keep a track on it, see what happens, and rooting for you, obviously.
Yeah, thank you. I think it'll make a lot of people happy when it gets sorted out.
Yeah, definitely, man. I just want to touch on last thing, and something that I'm experiencing at the moment, and that's work-life balance, and how being freelancers, whatever you want to call it. It's easy to work all the time, constantly, because always something you could do, always something you can do, basically. So how do you shut off? What's your routine to keep it sane?
Well, that was actually one of the things that really helped me as a positive when I made the transition from working with the rock band for 10 years and then working out of my home studio. And it's also one of the benefits to actually working as an engineer with clients is it can be more easy to, dictate what the hours are. I mean, it's not always easy. Sometimes people are like, why we want to work more.
Yeah.
But I just basically adopted a strategy. I was like, you know what? For a long time, I dreamed of having one day off a week, on the weekend or whatever. And then finally I dreamed of having a weekend off, And so I ended up just adopting the strategy. It's like, why can't I just work Monday through Friday, 8 hours a day like the rest of the working class does? And I started doing that. And I just told people I was working with, I work Monday through Friday, 10 to 6. Those are my hours. But here's the thing, that whether that sounds like a lot or a little to you, know this: when I'm working with you, I am 100% focused and 100% productive, and we are like in it to win it for 8 hours. And more likely than not, you will leave feeling amazed at how much you got done. And also, you won't be able to last as long as me in the studio anyway. So,
Right, yeah. I mean, that's exactly my experience too. Trying to adopt a more sane balance, I guess, is your productivity actually increases quite drastically.
Indeed, yeah. My productivity increased a huge amount. Like I say, when I was working with the rock band, we'd be 7 days a week, like every day from waking to sleeping, and spend a year on a record and not finish it. To me, that's just stupid.
Yeah.
Whereas now, like, once I've started really compartmentalizing my time, it allowed me to be really focused and really efficient and, avoid the wrong answer and focus on the right answer.
Yeah, exactly. But do you find that do you plan your days in advance too? Or do you do month ahead or week ahead? What's your thing?
Well, I mean, I'm not like, I'm not extremely type A, but I guess it depends on who you're asking. But my calendar looks pretty insane. I use Google Calendar. I use the different colored calendars on there. You don't really have to. You could just have one calendar if it's just you. But I do different ones for different aspects, studio or for my podcast, and I give them different colors, and that mostly just helps me visualize when I look at the calendar and see what colors are up there. I kind of know what's what. But I will now very carefully schedule out my days in advance, so I'll know, if I'm going to work on a particular project or part of a project. I will put it in my calendar for a couple of hours one day or a few hours or whatever. So I really know which part of the day I'm going to be working on that one thing. And that helps me a lot, because otherwise, at this point in my life, I've got so many different things I'm working on all at once. If I just try and tackle anything at any time, I find I don't get anything done. It's just too vague. It's too much. Here's a good example for me, because my podcast is one of the things that I do. And, I've got the editing, mixing side of it, and I've got the publishing side of it, where I'll sit down at one point and I will edit and mix the podcast and, get the audio right and bounce it out. And then it's ready for uploading and publishing. And then I'll sit down on another night, I actually just changed this because I got a couple of great assistants helping me now. But I would sit down on another point and I'd, make a WordPress blog post. I'd publish it to iTunes and all the other podcast hosts and YouTube. And I'd write an email to my email list, telling them that the new podcast was out, and schedule social media and tell the guest, hey, it's out. And, if I had sponsors on, I'd give them a heads up. Hey, your podcast is live today. So there's a whole checklist of stuff to do. And what I did is, at the beginning, you just got to kind of wing it and you got to stumble through it. And, I remember the first time I ever tried to make a blog post and publish something on YouTube and on a WordPress blog post, and it was something easy. I mean, it was something that was so simple. It took me an 8-hour day to figure it out.
Yeah.
You know? And now, having just done that stuff over and over and over again, particularly with my podcast, I got to the point where I was like, all right, these are the steps I need to take every time. I'm going to make myself a checklist, so I don't forget anything, because it's just too much. And you're working in a browser and you're having to hop around and stuff. And I know this is an audio related podcast, but this is very similar. So the publishing side, I would sit down and figure out what all those steps were, and then I'd make a checklist for myself, and then I'd start trying to time myself. So finally got it to the point where what used to take me maybe a day or two to do and get right, now I could sit down, start a timer for 45 minutes, and go through and just do it as quickly as possible, and like no bullshit, just like I would only do what absolutely needed to be done and what was the right answer, because I had, worked on it to get it to this point, and I'd be done in 40 minutes and I'd have like 5 minutes left over, on the timer. And that because I kind of like put myself to the test with that, it allowed me to really speed it up and be super, super efficient. And same thing with mixing the podcast. I'd set a timer for an hour, and I'd go through and I'd just quickly edit, and I'd do everything, and I'd repeat the same stuff that was working. And if it wasn't working, then I'd change it. But I probably, I might come back later and change it for the next one or something like that, or whatever. But my point is, like, in doing that, I took stuff that used to just take ages and ages, and I got it down to being able to do it in 45 minutes for each task. So that's my advice to whoever's listening, to your listeners, is like, and to you, is like, as you're trying to be efficient with your time or schedule your time out, part of scheduling it is giving yourself that ability, that skill set to do things in an efficient way, so that you can actually take an hour-long block or a 2-hour-long block, put it on your calendar, and go, I'm going to get this task done on this day at this time.
Yeah, exactly. That's perfect, man. That's perfect advice. And I'm going to try to time myself too, actually. See what I can.
It's good.
What's the one I
It's called? I have it right here. Whoops. Oh shoot! It's not on this computer. It's on a different one. It was I think it's like Timer Pro or B Timer or something like that. It's that Pomodoro principle. If you've heard of anybody talk about that, where you take a Pomodoro principle, is somebody once took a Pomodoro tomato kitchen timer, and they set it for 20 minutes, and they were like, I'm going to sit down and just focus for 20 minutes. And then when the timer goes up, I'll get up and I'll give myself a break for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and then I'll come back down and I'll set the timer again. And my workday will consist of sprint bursts like that, where I'm like super focused, and then I give myself an intentional break, super focused. And that kind of stuff can really work in the studio, because we actually have to give our ears a rest, and we usually don't want to, because we love music so much. But the problem with working super long days and not giving yourself a break is that your hearing actually just degrades. You're just not hearing accurately unless you give your ears a rest a lot.
Yeah, exactly. That's perfect advice, man. I'm going to try that too. So yeah, thanks for the tips, man.
Sure thing.
But thanks, Lij. Awesome talking to you.
It was great talking to you too, Nicholas.
Thank you very much, Lij, for being on this podcast. It was awesome talking to you. And I hope you, the listener, enjoyed it as much as I did. So don't forget to check out his podcast, Recording Studio Rockstars. Link in the description below. And so is a link to his studio, the Toy Box Studio. And before you go, don't forget to check out the free guide, 3 tested ways to increase your client base. Learn how to reach out to new clients online, getting your foot in the door to studios, or just finding more opportunities. Check it out at youraudiosolutions.com. And before you leave, I would really appreciate it if you can leave a rating and a comment below.
so iTunes can work its magic. So yeah, take care, and I'll see you next week.